Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today has works of fiction, poetry, and essays in various literary journals and magazines. A resident of Northeast Oklahoma, she teaches English at a small college in Arkansas and writes fiction to escape the sometimes grim reality of grading composition papers. Her first book, White River Red, a novel, was published April 2021. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Becky Marietta.
Thank you so much, Julia, for having me. I'm so excited to meet with you and to talk.
Well, Becky, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
That's a great question and so encouraging, I think, for those of us who took a long time to get there. I'd always been a storyteller and a reader and a writer, and I had published short pieces, and I always felt like I had a novel in me, and I had written the first 120 pages of a novel for my master's thesis, and written a memoir for my undergraduate, but I never got to the point where I thought, okay, these are the ones. And then my grandpa started telling me, my grandpa loved to tell me stories about Arkansas way back in the day. And one day he said to me, have I ever told you about that old gal, White River Red? And I said, no, that sounds good. Let's talk about it. So he told me some great stories about her. And then I went to there's a little museum, Shiloh Museum in Arkansas, and they were doing a special event where they had invited anybody who had memories of White River Red to come and talk. And so I just remembered those stories of my grandpa's, and I thought, oh, I've got to go do that. So I went and I listened, and I realized as I was listening that I was taking notes, not really knowing why. And as I was leaving, I noticed that I was the only person there that did not have white hair. And I thought, it's sad to me that this amazing woman, once these people pass on, she's going to pass out of memory as well. And I thought, how could her story be told in a bigger way? And so I thought, well, what kind of research is there? And I found a 7-page booklet by Philip Steele, a local historian who's now passed on. And that was it. And so I thought, well, what I do is fiction. And what if I take what I know about her and then develop character and motivation and themes and that it was just the right story. And so it came around when I was, in my late 40s and then published when I was 51. So it just took for the right story to come along, I think.
Well, my mother was an English teacher. I was a teacher, and my eldest daughter is a teacher. So we applaud you for the difference you're making in so many young people's lives.
Thank you.
Maybe as English majors, we always want to write the great American novel. So tell us more about the inspiration for yours.
Yeah, I do love Southern fiction. I actually grew up in Kenya, East Africa. My parents were missionaries. But when we would come home for furlough, all of my family are from Arkansas. All of my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, they all lived here. So I honestly grew up thinking that Arkansas was America. I didn't really realize that there were other places or that might be different for me. Arkansas was America. And so I've always been drawn to Southern stories, hearing those Southern voices in writing. I could hear my grandmothers and my aunts and my uncles and even my mom, with her soft Southern accent. And I think that was one of the things that made this story right for me, was that it was a chance for me to really sort of settle into that Southern voice that I had grown up sort of idealizing. And it felt kind of like coming home to be able to write about the things that had captured my imagination as a child visiting Arkansas.
Well, this woman was certainly the inspiration, but how did you come up with a plot for her since there was so little research available?
To be honest, the very little bits that were known about her were enough for, I think, for me, it was like almost a made for TV movie. Like in fact, I've had so many people say, when is this going to be made into a movie? And I'm like, well, it's not really my department, but thanks for asking. So if anybody out there wants to, talk about making it a movie, apparently a lot of people are interested. I mean, Forestina is her name, and she ran away from home in 1906 when she was 15 years old and joined the circus, which, I always hear, I'm going to run away and join the circus. But in my research, I found out that was a common thing, which is why it sort of became a stereotype. So she ran away from home. She joined the circus. She was in a trapeze. She had a terrible accident that forced her to leave it. And then she started a carnival circuit around Northwest Arkansas. And a lot of people, after the book, I've had older people come up to me and say, I remember her when I was a kid doing the Tawny Town Grape Festival. And she had this game with rats. She had a white rat, a black rat, and a gray rat. And then this big wheel of, she called it her wheel of chance with colors. And from my understanding, you would bet which color rat would go into which color hole. And that's how you got your payout. So she was just such a colorful character on her own. But, they talked about how she, my grandpa talked about how she was always wearing men's clothing, overalls and a hat. She swore like a sailor. And when I was reading Mr. Steele's little booklet, he was talking about how, she was viewed as quite beautiful in her youth and came from money. And so I started thinking, okay, what would cause a woman to hide her femininity, to go from sort of this very proper life to this life of a nomad. I mean, she had a bar on the White River. And she had red hair. That's where she got the name White River Red. So that's where the title of my book comes from. And so I invented, that's where I started inventing things. I started inventing motivations and filling in the blanks. And as I began to write, the thing that attracted me were the stories that, even though she was a nomad, she also cared for people. If she found out somebody was hungry, she'd show up and just leave groceries on their porch and get real mad if anybody tried to thank her for that. And so this generosity, that was really something that I wanted to bring out. And as I did that, her character really just sort of developed, and I found strength. And there was just a lot there that, as a character, she was just a joy to write. So
she sounds like a larger than life character and someone that would be great fun to write about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, once you actually wrote the book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to use a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
I started with the agent route. I had decided early on that because it took me so long to write this book, that I wanted to try to go the traditional road, because I know self-publishing. I know some people have some great, amazing books. I wasn't ready for the marketing aspect of that. And I thought, well, if I've taken this long to write the book, I really just kind of want to see it through. And see what that process is. And so I started by looking at different agents. I had a few agents reach out, but I kind of found myself a little bit in turmoil sometimes, because I would read up on some of the people and I would just feel like I didn't connect really with maybe some of the same sort of ideas or value systems. So I started thinking maybe I would like a small press. And so I one of my bucket lists as getting published as an author is one of them. The other one, strangely, was becoming working at a library. It was because when I grew up in Kenya, I was a voracious reader. We didn't have any libraries where I lived, so I would have to drive. We would drive 6 hours to the capital city. I would buy as many books as I could at the used bookstore, and then I'd have them all read by the time I got home, and I'd have to wait for another month to go back in, trade them in. So when I visited my grandma, I think when I was about 10 years old, she took me to the Prairie Grove Library in Arkansas, and she said, you can get 10 books for free, and if you finish them tonight, we'll come back tomorrow. And I remember thinking, is America heaven? So I just fell in love with the idea of libraries. And so when I saw our local library had need of a page, someone to just push a cart around and put books up, I thought, even though I was teaching English, even though I was, in the process of trying to find a publisher, I thought, I've got to try this. So, I mean, they kind of laughed at me and said, you do know this is a job we usually give 16-year-olds, right? I said, I don't care. Just so as I loved every minute, I worked for probably about 7-8 months. I would pay attention to the books that I was shelving, and the books that looked similar, maybe in style or tone, I would take a minute and open them up and, look and see if it's agent, if it's a publishing. And I carried a little pad of paper in my back pocket, and I would scribble down those names. And then I would go home and research what kind of publisher it was, what did they look for. So my advice to people, if they're not sure, is, do that. Go to the library. You could go to the bookstore, but the library has so many different, I think, options that aren't always maybe just the current that, and nobody looks at you funny if you're in the library for a super long time taking notes. So I would advise, see, who's being thanked, what agents are being thanked if you're going the agent route, or for me, scribble down the publisher's name and then do your research. And so when I found Touchpoint, I got on, and one of the things I loved was, first of all, it was a publishing company based in Arkansas, which I thought, okay, that's a good sign. And I also liked how the publisher talked about her faith, and the deputy, right there on their website. And so I thought, okay, this feels like a connection of people that, for me, that's something that I'm interested in. So
that was a perfect way to find your comp titles and your publisher all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned marketing, and those of us who write don't want to promote ourselves, but have you found any publicity that's worked for you?
To be honest, I think having a network, I had stayed off Facebook for years and years and years, and my publisher said, you have to get back on Facebook. So I got on Facebook, and I have so many friends that they were all very excited about the book. And what has happened, which I think I didn't go out seeking this as a marketing thing, but I would say if there is a way to do it, it's very worth it. My book became a surprisingly hot commodity for book clubs. So all of a sudden, I had women from all over the place, reading my book, contacting me saying, hey, we're reading your book. Would you come visit? And so I said, of course. And so I have gone to, I want to say probably 8 or 9, maybe 10 book clubs as their visitor. Each one's different, and it has been so much fun. But one of the great things is, you're picking up these different readers, and then they get excited and they send it on to their friends. And so if you can get, like I said, I didn't actively try to become a book club pick, but somehow, I mean, my book was picked up at the Arkansas Library Association. They have their own book clubs where they will, they will reserve, I think, like 12 books, and you can reserve those for your different book clubs in Arkansas. And Dolores, at the time, my head librarian, she emailed me and said, hey, your book has been reserved for the entire year, the sets of books around Arkansas. And so that has been a surprising marketing thing that, sometimes I mention it now on my websites. Hey, if you're looking for a book club pick, and I would be happy to do it via Zoom if, I have done a couple of those where um, the people have lived farther away and we've got on, and it's a lot of fun. So
I agree. I love book clubs. And I think if your book has a theme, yours has a great setting that's almost a character as well. So, of course, Arkansas would be interested in your book, but that character brings up a lot of discussion, just like my first book was about adoption. And that's a hot topic among women today as well. So, I think when we have a platform or a theme or a setting, that lends itself to publicity, I think we should certainly exploit that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's always fun to see what readers get out of your book. I had one of the book clubs I went to. They were very organized, and the woman in charge of it had written these great questions, kind of like I would write for my literature class in college. And so listening to the readers talk about different themes or the characters, and I would just sit there listening to it, and they say, okay, so now when you were working on it, and I would laugh and I'd say, to be honest, you guys think I'm a lot smarter than I wish I had thought of that as a theme. So I love that bond, because being a reader myself, I know how I feel connected to readers and to stories and characters. And so that has just been an absolute delight. I'm an introvert, but this is one thing that I have just loved that I never really expected to.
Well, I didn't know what Zoom meant until the pandemic.
Right,
And
me either.
so now we can Zoom into anybody's living room all around the country or world. So it really helps us to get out there and not have to drive to all these locations. Uh,
Absolutely.
I think it's wonderful, and maybe you should get those questions and put them in the back of your book for book club discussions if they were
That's a
so
great
great.
idea. That is a great. I have gotten her permission before. I've had other people say, "Oh, we're gonna. Do you have any questions?" And so I've contacted that lady and said, "Can I use your questions?" She said, "Sure." So yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. If we do a reprint, put a book club questions in the back. That's a great idea.
And I think we don't tout ourselves enough as authors, but I've been in a book club for many years and we've never had an author come to speak to us. So I think when an author can drop in and speak to a book club, it means so much to them as readers.
Yeah, yeah, I agree because, again, as a reader myself, I know how I felt. I got to see Margaret Atwood doing a reading. She's one of my favorite living authors. And then to have her sign my book, I was just giddy. And it was funny I'm not comparing myself to Margaret Atwood, but on a smaller scale, to have that same feeling when people are like, oh, the author, it's like, wow. So that's what that feels like.
It's very touching.
It is. It is. It's humbling.
Well, Becky, why don't you tell us about the passage you brought to share today and then read from your book so we can hear your tone and voice?
Absolutely. So this is after Forestina has had her circus experience and had to leave the circus. She was, without giving it too much away, she was married and something happened. And so now she's no longer married and she's sort of away from the circus, everything she had ever wanted. And so this is when she meets Jack, who becomes later on her second husband. And so this is their first meeting and this sort of idea where she sort of gets this second lease on life. Is where she kind of starts her carnival experience because she's, like I said, something terrible has happened. She's kind of licking her wounds, thinking, all right, I'm going to have to be regular. And then she meets Jack, and this is sort of the setup for the next part of her life that's anything but regular. So this is interlude 1914. Forestina wandered through the carnival, winding her way back and forth through the rows and rows of booths, taking in the heat and the excitement. As she approached the Test Your Strength Tower, she paused to watch the barker in charge of the game do his thing. He was tall, over 6 feet, Forestina guessed, and heavily built like a lumberjack, and he sported an impressive brushy red-brown beard to boot. In each of his big hands, he held the rubber-headed mallets that were used to strike the game's pad, twirling them in slow arcs as if they weighed nothing. Spotting Forestina, he offered one of the handles to her. Want to test your strength, little lady? He asked. There's a quarter in it for you if you hit hard enough to ring the bell. A man standing in the small knot of people surrounding the game guffawed. How can that little bitty thing hit the bell? She's no bigger than a fly. Don't waste your nickel, girl, he advised. He winked at her. I got a better game for you. It's called Find the Weasel. It's in my pants. You can play for free. Forestina cast a long, measuring look at the pale, clean-shaven, ferret-eyed Rube. He was the type of guy who would come into her cafe and argue that a little squeeze of her bottom was an expected side dish to the coffee she poured, and don't even think about him leaving a tip. She hated him on sight. Reaching with her right hand into the small beaded change purse attached by a velvet cord to her left wrist, she pulled out a shiny new nickel. Holding it high for all to see, pinched between thumb and forefinger, she offered it to the huge bear of a man running the game. As he held his giant palm out for her to drop the nickel into, she smiled at him sweetly and leaned forward. Where's the sweet spot? She whispered, trying not to move her lips as she did so. And where's the dummy mallet, the one I can actually swing? He stood back and examined her from top to bottom, a slow grin of admiration spreading across his face. She noticed that between his mustache and beard were straight, very white teeth and a pair of rather shapely lips. He handed her the mallet in his left hand. Let me show you how to lift and swing, he said loudly. He put one hand beneath her elbow and with the other hand lifted the long wooden neck of the mallet, his fingers gripping below where she held the mallet in both of her hands. As he stood close to her, he murmured in her ear, upper right corner, just above the pad. Make it look good. He released her and stepped away. Forestina let the mallet drop suddenly, her body bending as if the sheer weight was too much for her. She dragged the head of it, in truth it weighed no more than a croquet mallet, through the dirt and positioned herself in front of the slim rectangular sign that stretched above her some 6 feet. It was divided by such scientific strength assessments as puny at the bottom, kid sister, preteen boy, now you're growing up, and finally at the top near the steel bell, strong man, you win. As she gazed upwards, she swallowed hard. That bell seemed very far away. The Rube who had started all of this jeered at her. Really, what a waste, he called out. She can't even pick the hammer up. He stepped forward, reaching for the mallet. Why don't you let me take care of that for you, sweetie? He asked, his beady eyes glittering like a snake's. The carnival barker stepped in. Back off, buddy. Her nickel, her swing. The Rube opened his mouth as if to argue, then, his eyes taking in the size of the man in front of him, seemed to think better of it. Suits me, he shrugged. I'm happy to watch her make a fool of herself. Forestina resisted an urge to use the mallet to smash him in the face. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the hammer over her head, pretending that it took all of her strength to do so, and then let it drop exactly where the barker had said. As she did, she moved to her right, blocking the view of the spectators just slightly so that they could not see where the blow landed. The black disc inside the glass casing of the sign shot straight up and smacked the bell with a resounding ding, and the crowd, -1 of course, cheered. The barker raised his remaining mallet over his head. Way to go, miss, he said. Take a bow. He nodded at the crowd and winked at her. She obeyed, sweeping her arms and skirts out wide, curtsying first right and then left. As she distracted the Rube, she saw the barker bend down to pick up the light mallet she had dropped. He deftly tossed it under the low-sheeted platform they were standing on, then just as deftly pulled out a different mallet. He straightened, dug into his pocket, and produced a quarter. Here you go, missy, he said, handing it to her. She accepted it with a beatific smile. The carnival barker addressed the crowd. So who's next? Who wants to try Jack Campbell's game of strength? Who has the courage to try their skill after this Amazonian creature showed us all how it's to be done? The crowd laughed, obviously enjoying the joke that the tiny red head in front of them could be deemed Amazonian. Forestina hammed it up, flexing her biceps at them. Come on, the man said. Don't let old Jack down. Is there no one in the crowd willing to represent the male of the species? He pointed to the obnoxious Rube from before. How about you? He asked. You sure were saying a lot before. You think you can do as well as this little girl? The rube scowled, and his friends standing with him started their taunts. Yeah, come on, Mark, one man said. Show us something. Jack placed his booted foot on a stool that stood nearby. How about we make it interesting, he said to Mark. 50-1 that you can't hit that bell. Before Mark could answer, Forestina held her newly won quarter up in the air. Jack, is it? She asked, addressing the man running the game. He nodded. I would also like to lay a bet. Is that allowed? Jack stroked his beard. It's a free country, he said. What did you have in mind? Forestina turned to Mark, who was watching her with his washed out, snaky eyes. I bet you my 2 bits to yours that you can't do better than me, she said. The crowd hooted in appreciation of her pluck. I'll lay a bet against that, a friend of Mark said. He pulled out a quarter too. Mine against yours that Mark will hit that bell in one try.
That's great.
Other people in the crowd started to pull their money out as well, hollering to join the betting, obviously convinced that if Forestina could hit the bell, surely a man would have no problem. Jack held up his right hand, palm out. Okay, he said, voice raised to be heard over the clamor. He reached into his back pants pocket and pulled out a small wire-bound notebook and a pencil. He noted down everyone's bet, then said, okay, bets are closed. If Mark hits that bell, we divide the winnings between you all. If he doesn't, he shrugged, then it gets split between me and, he raised his eyebrow at her, and she said, Forestina. Forestina, lovely name for a lovely woman, he commented, scribbling again on his pad of paper. Before handing Mark a mallet, Jack said casually, I noticed you didn't put any money up against the lady. You need to fork a quarter over, buddy. Flushing, Mark dug into his front pants pocket and pulled out 2 dimes and a nickel. Here, he grumbled, shoving the coins towards Jack, who calmly added it to the pile of silver in his hand. He jotted down Mark's name with a flourish. Come on, Mark said. I ain't got all day. Impassively, Jack held out both mallets to Mark. You want to pick which one to swing with? He asked. Mark grabbed for both of them, and when Jack let go, he was pulled downwards by the weight, almost falling over. The crowd laughed, and he flushed again. Dropping one of the mallets, he lined himself up and lifted his arms overhead, swinging down as hard as he could on the center of the square black pad, grunting with effort. The disc inside the glass rose all the way to Kid's sister. The crowd of people clapped and jeered, seeming to forget that most of them had just lost money. Jack put a sympathetic paw on Mark's shoulder. "Aw, brother," he said, "tough luck." He turned to the crowd. "I think our man here was just warming up. What do you say? Shall we call that a practice run and let him try again?" They all clapped their assent. Mark snarled, "Let me use the other mallet." Jack handed it to him, and Mark breathed out heavily before raising it overhead with both hands and slamming it down on the black square. "Kid's sister," the sign informed him flatly. Amid the new burst of laughter, Forestina cupped her hands around her mouth and called out, "Why didn't you bring a real man with you to help you, kid sister?" Bellowing with rage, Mark flung the handle of the mallet down. "You stupid broad," he spat out at Forestina. "There's no way you could have hit that bell." Understanding slowly dawned in his ugly face. "Unless the game is rigged and you're part of it." He raised his fist and took a step forward. "I ought to knock your teeth out." The crowd fell silent as Forestina dug her heels in and lifted her chin. No matter what, she was not going to flinch away. She'd sooner die. Before he could unload on her, though, Jack reached over almost casually and lifted Mark by the scruff of his neck.
That's a great story.
Thanks.
I remember the state fair in Mississippi, and all of my children would try to get me on the scale to win a toy by my weight. Oh, mercy.
I'm not sure there's a toy worth that.
It was take one for the team for sure. Well, it's such a great story. Do you have any other books in you?
I think I do. I'm currently working on a book set in Arkansas again, based on a band of gypsies in the 1980s. I'm kind of vacillating where I thought it was going to go one direction, and it's kind of wanting to go another direction. So we're going to kind of see where it takes us on that. And I've also written a memoir about growing up at boarding school in Kenya. So I'm working on that, trying to figure out what the legalities are in terms of, when you're writing about a real place. It is written affectionately, so I've got that going for me. But so I would love to finish that at some point. When I first wrote it, it was in the 2000s, and life wasn't as it hadn't moved as quickly, and so I was looking back, thinking, what, a book written in the 1970s, 1980s is ancient history now. When you think about no internet, no no telephones, no, in Kenya at that time, there was one TV channel that started at 5 p.m. and ended at 10 p.m. And Kenya's not the same place anymore. So I thought, there's enough time that it would show a lot of nostalgia. So hopefully at least those two.
Well, I wrote about the 60s in my first book, and that's historical now.
Right. Yeah, I think those of us who live through those, we do look at it with nostalgia. And those young people, they look at it like this is ancient history. How could you live without a phone, a smartphone? So
That's exactly right.
yeah.
Well, you love literature and you've always read. If you could ask your author idol one question, what would it be?
Who? My author idol, I have so many. Um, one of my idols is Shirley Jackson. I love, I grew up reading scary books, Stephen King. This is one of the things growing up in boarding school. You read things your parents would never let you read. So I grew up cutting my teeth on Stephen King and scary books. And so when I discovered Shirley Jackson and her own brand of creepiness and then her development of character, I'm fascinated by her. And then I read her memoirs about her kids, Life Among Savages and Raising Demons, and they are the funniest books I have ever read. I just roared with laughter the whole time. And so what I would like to ask Shirley Jackson, if she were with us, would be, how do you let those different sides of yourself come out? How do you, because a lot of times I think we feel like we're stuck in a certain genre or a certain voice. How do you just kind of let yourself go and go, okay, this part of me is kind of dark and looks at the world with cynicism, and yet here I've got this hilarious, joyful view of life. And so how do you reconcile those, and how do you allow yourself the freedom to not pigeonhole yourself to one type of writing? Because I don't think I've got that figured out.
That would be a great question. And I love interviewing people who use humor in not so humorous situations. And, there are so many different sides to authors and our creative imaginations that those would be great questions to ask them. What does writing success look like to you personally?
I love that question. I looked over your list and I thought, oh, this is great. I love this question because for me, like I said, the book clubs have shown me how much I love connecting with readers. And it's not just the book clubs, when you get a note from someone or somebody writes a review that's positive and you think, they got that. So for me, success is really being able to maybe bring some joy to people's lives, to make that connection. One of my lovely readers, she had gone through an abusive marriage, and she said reading the strength of my character really just gave her so much comfort and courage. And so being able to make that connection with readers, to me, is successful. It's not always going to happen. I don't love every book I read, and I don't expect every person to read my book, love my book, and that's fine. But I hope success for me is, to make more connections than less, and to be able to just bring to people's lives, the joy of fiction and storytelling. And for myself, reading is that perfect escape where you can spend a little time somewhere else with other people who are different than you, and still just sort of bring that humanity back to it. And so for me, that's success, is when readers connect with my my work, however that looks for them.
What do your students think about having an author as their teacher, and do you encourage any of them to become writers?
It's funny because I have a few that are, really excited. And then I have, 18, 19-year-olds sometimes aren't as interested beyond their own pathway of life. So that's fair. So I have had some students, though, that it's funny because last semester, Tantor Media bought the rights to do the audio of my book, and the narrator does an amazing job. I was just thrilled when I heard it. And so I thought, I forget to read the reviews on Audible. And so I kind of happened to read over that. And one of them, I'm not going to say his name, but it had a name. And then when I had class the next semester, the person with that same name was in my class. And I looked at him for a few minutes. And then I asked after class, I said, did you by chance listen to my book? And he started laughing and he said, yes, I did. And I said, well, you gave me the nicest review. And he said, I didn't really think about authors reading their reviews. So that was a pleasant surprise. And then I've had creative writing students who want to talk to me about the process, and I'm always just overjoyed to help them in that part and give them advice.
Becky, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have any advice for writers 50 and above?
Yes, I'm sure that it's similar, but don't give up. Don't ever think that you're too old to write. I think one of my favorite examples was, and I should have thought about, I don't remember her name, but she wrote this book called Over the Hill. And she wrote it in her 80s, and it was sort of snippets about her life and what she saw in the nursing home she was living in. And it's hysterical. It's so cute. And that was her first book. And I think, we have our own stories to tell. And they are just as important and just as interesting. And I think there's always an audience for us, and I don't think you have to be an older person to enjoy older people's writings. And so my first thing would be, don't give up. It's never too late. Obviously, try to write as much as you can, but give yourself a break. Let yourself go through the seasons of life. Sometimes things are going to be slower. Sometimes things are going to be busier. Embrace that as part of it. And then read. I mean, I know these are oldies but goodies, but they're kind of that for a reason. Read a lot. The kinds of things you're interested in, the kinds of things maybe you don't think you're interested in. And as you read, love the story, but also pay attention as an artist to pacing and description and plot. And I think that is a keen skill you develop as you read more and more. So I really think the best writers are usually the best readers. So
that's great advice. And I hear from so many authors that they've written journals all their lives, and sometimes they'll turn those journals into a book, or sometimes they'll just pass them along to their family, like your grandfather did stories to you. So either way, I hope that everybody will know that these books or these journals are legacies for our families, and we shouldn't let these stories be lost, and we should pass them along. So we're excited that you have a great one to pass along as your legacy. And we're excited to now say that you're counted among our authors over 50.
Yay, thank you. I love it. I think that's a great group to be in. This is a club I want to be in. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.